I'm excited to be talking to both of you. We've got a very special co-host today and a very special guest. So this is full on incredible coffee session. It's like Christmas came early, and that is why I am wearing my Christmas sweater a little bit early this season, but it can never be early enough. So, John, I'm excited to talk to you. Adam, also, we were chatting behind the scenes, and Adam is going to be my co-host for today. He was telling me how much of what we spoke about has been resonating with him. And in case anyone doesn't know, Adam actually posted something really cool in Slack that has to do with what kind of information or material are people out there lacking? What is the community lacking? What would you like to see more of? And whether that is like end-to-end example blog posts, or it's more podcast talking heads like myself and all of us, what is it that we need more of? And so there's a great thread. We'll throw the link in the description below so that you all can see that and chime in if you would like. But for now, John, we're talking to you, and I think that little intro is a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask you first, which is, what are some main trends that you've been seeing when it comes to machine learning and MLOps more specifically?
Hello. So maybe before we get into the wish list for Christmas, I think we will get into that soon. If I can take a step back, maybe in a longer time window on those trends, maybe I'll start with, let's say, changing from a project-oriented ML towards product-oriented ML. So that's, let's say, a trend that I have seen in different companies. So it's probably something that came from initially in the academia. The papers that are published, it's very model-centric, so it trickles down into articles, and then libraries, and then tutorials and courses for those libraries, and then it becomes a job description for who you need to hire if you want to build a data science team. But that kind of gave the impression that models, projects are interchangeable, so it used to be a bit of a 0-to-1 approach to ML in the industry in the past, where you want to build something, you have nothing, and in 6 months you have something, and then you move on and you build something different. Instead of now something that looks, I feel that we are building things that look more like longer term product, where the intention is to iterate and constantly improve on the longer term, rather than building and then it's done, if that makes sense.
Okay, I love that example of product versus project. And it reminds me of something that one of our meetup guests said, how you can get stuck in POC hell. One question that I have for you is, what are some of these different symptoms that you see when you have a project-led machine learning product, I guess, for lack of a better word, or a product-led data product or machine learning product?
I can think of two aspects to the answer. Maybe something we can park for later is whether it's always applicable, because you don't always have the business case for building a long-term product. Sometimes you just want to roll out a simple feature. But in the case of the product, I think it means that we are moving towards a more decentralized approach. So where the teams would build those products, which contains a bit of ML in the middle, but I've rarely or never, I don't think I've ever worked on a machine learning problem where ML was the only part of the solution. It's always one component in a larger system that contains all sorts of other algorithms and tools to serve a product. And so that creates teams that are specialized on that topic. So which could be a recommender or a search or a document classifier. But those teams really would end up specializing on those products, and the recruitment and the maintenance would be for the product specifically, rather than having a central team where interchangeable data scientists work on everything.
No, I totally get that. And so I agree with some of the comments you've made about putting really simple stuff out there. And you always find that, for better or worse, people play with models, get really into it, build something. And I always think, like, being techies, we like complicated and we like building funky stuff and we like tech for tech's sake. And then actually you put it in the hands of the customer and they just smash it to bits and it doesn't quite do what they want, or they want a thing that you didn't think was really important becomes super important. So I love that. And I do say to a lot of our team that, yeah, look, like, stick a random number generator into production, because you'll very quickly build all the stuff you need. And I think that's a really important point. And one of the things you also touched on earlier, like in the sort of preparation notes for this, is talking about, and it's to do with that product mindset versus project mindset, where you, instead of it's like the one and done, right, get the data scientist in, do the model, and then move them on to the next project, you keep iterating. How does that translate to issues, or have you had any experience of issues with actually you just haven't got the resources in, you can't hire enough people to keep someone maintaining that permanently? And my mind really going towards kind of data engineers in the current market, right? No one can get enough of them. We want hundreds of them. What do you do about that? Can you do the proper product-led stuff with limited resource, I guess is what I'm asking.
What can we do about that? I think it's a very good question. I think there are other, going back to maybe Dimitrios' original questions of what the symptoms are. You mentioned one of those symptoms, which is the difficulties of recruiting and keeping enough people in the team that are specialized. I think we just have to work for the staffing part of the question. I think we have to work around it. We try and experiment and learn on the job and go outside of our comfort zone to do things that we learn as we go. In terms of symptoms, I think that's something else that is also worth mentioning, which is by having a decentralized approach, you will also end up, in your organization, you will end up reinventing the wheel a bit more. So it's good to have some kind of central team or incentives for your different data scientists to make sure that they can build reusable and shareable solutions within the organization. There are probably different ways of doing that. It makes me think of, I think there was a coffee session here with someone from Stitch Fix who talked about Hamilton. That's one example of a product that is built within the organization, and you go to the different team, you ask, is it useful for you? If not, how can I make it useful? So having this kind of extra solutions that are offered to the team to mitigate a bit the impact of decentralization and reinventing the same solution. I think monitoring is another example that I have seen, where a central team offers helpers and tools for monitoring your models that apply to the different specialized teams.
So there's one thing that you said before we started recording, and I thought it was fascinating, and it was around going into production and how you don't like to use that word. And it comes back to this, like, this different mindsets that you can have. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that is and how in the past you've seen, or some trends that you saw were just trying to go from 0 to 1, but now it feels like we've gotten there and we've shown something. And so now when people talk about taking something to production, you have a little bit of beef with that. What's that all about?
Yeah, I think, first of all, once you decide that you want to build a new ML product, there's no reason to wait before having anything in production. And that can be just a simple baseline, or even just a model that predicts 0 all the time. There's already a lot of work that can be done, and that does not need to wait until you have a first ML or non-ML solution to your problem, which makes me think of a post by Eugene Yan that was shared on the community recently on the first rule of ML. I think it was a few days ago, which also pointed to that, slightly differently, but kind of related. You may want to start with a non-ML solution. And yeah, slightly different, because what I meant is not purely put in production something that is non-ML, but have something up and running as quickly as possible. So you are in a mindset where the model is not too central, but it's an interchangeable piece. Like on the long term, I think your goal is to be able to iterate as quickly as possible. I think for me, the bottleneck has really always been how fast can you iterate and try new models. And in order to overcome that bottleneck, I think you want to build really the factory that enables you to iterate fast, and you don't need to wait to have you don't need to build a solution around your first model. You want to build a system, and then the model should be like an interchangeable piece that can change in the middle of it.
I completely agree with that. Interesting then, I'd love to talk a bit about the bottleneck part. What do you find, like, what specific skills do you find data scientists or teams lack or need more of to maybe overcome those bottlenecks? Like, what are those challenges in your experience?
That's a good one. I would be tempted to go in the direction of software engineering.
Okay.
So a bit like this old stereotype of I have a notebook and I want to put it in production. Yeah.
I completely get that. So actually, right, I ended up having to POC a piece of work at work last week. And I did exactly that, but a really basic model, but did all the kind of bare bones of it. I did it in notebooks, which I actually hate notebooks normally, but I did it in notebooks to do it really quickly. And then, right, we need to get this sort of into a production state. And I came to the point where I said, because we've got loads of software engineers and could maybe do with more data people. And I said, well, look, I could turn this, do this nicely, or I could just fire you a script that kind of does the job. And they were like, look, you'll just do it wrong anyway. Let us just handle it. Like, fine by me. You go.
Well, one thing that I find interesting is it sounds like this has been coming up quite a bit, and it's kind of a recurring theme that I've been hearing from people who have a lot of experience, in my opinion. And the theme or the mantra is just get something out there as quickly as possible, get that baseline out there, and then you can make it pretty. And then you can go and add all the different nice flourishing to it, right? And so I just wonder if we've all, or if so many people have done that, and we are kind of screaming from the mountaintops, like, this is what we need to do. When is it going to get through our heads that this is how it works? And then we don't have to say it anymore because it's just a given, right? That's what we do as part of the process. This is like step one. We just get something out there as simple and as quickly as possible. And then step two, we can figure out later. But it does feel like a little bit like we hear it time and time again for a reason, right? Because I imagine you didn't do that originally. Neither of you were doing that. And then you did it and you realized, wow, this is a much better way to do it. Like, I am going crazy trying to over-engineer something or do something that is not really where I'm providing value. And so you start to see the light at the end of the tunnel when you learn about this way.
Yeah, I mean, going back a bit to your previous comment on proof of concept and why I have a beef with proof of concept, I think it's for me, it's like the exploratory analysis. What a lot of people call proof of concept is usually the exploratory analysis, like a quick and dirty estimation of your business case, which makes sense. But it's not complete in the sense that you've not tested, can it run in production? Can it go fast enough? Can it meet my SLA with those complex features? So that's also why you want to deploy something as quickly as possible.
Well, and this gets into the idea that I know you wanted to touch on, and it's around like, is there always a business case for machine learning or MLOps in small organizations?
Yeah, exactly. That's something mentioned early on. When we try to think of what would be a good level of, let's say that you have a good MLOps maturity once your bottleneck becomes the speed at which you get the feedback from your users. Like once you can iterate fast enough, but it's only the pace at which you get the feedback that is slowing you down. But not all features that contain ML are necessarily in a situation where you will always improve upon. I mentioned early in the talk, small features rolled out quickly into production. It's not always something that will be monitored, or where the extra value you get by a 1% improvement is going to justify the time you spend on it. So I have seen examples like that of, let's say, recommendation of the products that you buy most frequently. There's a bit of ML in it to find similar products and build on them as one instead of just using a product ID. So the idea was to just make the customer happier. But if you want to measure the customer happiness, that's an entirely more complex problem than the feature you've just built. So if you want to, it's not something that you're going to A/B test a lot or constantly push to get a 1% improvement. It's not like the large tech companies where a small improvement results immediately in billions of extra revenue.
And so in that point where you're talking about, I really love that quote about you've got good MLOps maturity when your limiting factor is the speed of feedback. I love that. That's a really good definition. In gathering that feedback then, do you think that is best suited to product owners and traditional kind of product owner type skill sets, or data scientists, or a blend? Because I find that in a few circumstances I've seen, that's been quite a challenge actually, how to communicate the art of the possible of what could be done next and what the next steps are, communicate the difficulty and the relevance of things, but also translate the business needs back to those people that can do the doing.
So when I mentioned feedback earlier, I had the feedback for data scientists in mind, that in the sense you have new label data. I was maybe assuming that it was the kind of feedback where the interaction with the customer gives you some new label data, which is not always the case. So what I was talking about was maybe a special case of feedback for data scientists. But obviously what you said makes a lot of sense as well. It's in the end, it's up to the product owner to kind of decide the direction and priorities and next steps based on feedback as a whole, in the sense that you're not the product owner would not necessarily be looking at typical model performances metrics, but it's more into the concept of in the end you're serving a user user in the real world, and when you look at statistical metrics, you're looking at a proxy for customer retention, customer happiness. So there's like the mathematical feedback from a pure modeling perspective, but of course you also need to look at it from the more global perspective of what is it that you're trying to do in the organization.
Do you think that might be a specialist kind of role then that we're not seeing much of? I know there's certain, I think Google put out like a ML product owner series of lectures or something. Do you think that could become a more substantial thing?
It could. Back to what you said earlier, when we are already under troubles, having troubles finding staff to fill the teams. I don't know if adding more roles is necessarily something that people would be happy to hear, but in an ideal scenario, that's not a role that I have seen so far. But that's a great point. It's something that maybe should exist to kind of bridge that gap between the quantitative metric and the actual business objective.
Yeah, so there's something interesting also that you said earlier, and it's like this data factory is what you called it. I had heard another guest call it something like that. So you have a very clear, like when you think of a factory, it brings up nice images of a car being made or something, and everything going and doing its one single function really well. And I'm wondering if you have insights on how to build out that factory when it comes to not only, like Adam was saying, the team and who owns what, because I remember probably a few months ago now, we had Ewan Nicholson on, and he was talking about how basically he showed two slides to us in the meetup, and one was where it was a clear division of who does what and where. And so you had like the green section, and that was the data engineer, and then you had the data scientist was a little bit red, and then the DevOps people, that was purple or whatever color, I can't remember. And then he said what MLOps has brought to his team is something along the lines of blending it all. And so instead of seeing like these clear colors and separation, you saw more of a gradient picture. And so it blended that, and it was in, he also said that it enabled, like MLOps enabled all of these teams to be able to speak the same language. And so I guess bringing that back around to you in this data factory, it's like, how do you see different people working on and in the data factory?
That's a great point, by the way, and it's relating to Adam's question earlier. What skills are lacking? I'm 100% with you on the more overlaps you have between the different people, different skills in the team, the better your team will function. That's I have observed well-functioning and less well-functioning situations where there was either like a gap between the skills or overlaps between the skills. So that's absolutely crucial. For the data factory, what I meant is really how fast can you iterate with your models? Your goal is to get that MLOps maturity of where the bottleneck is, how fast you get your feedback. So your factory is really the system in which you build and iterate. Absolutely, you need a multidisciplinary team that can cover all the different components. It would be very difficult to find one full stack person, and that full stack person would end up with spending a lot of time on some problems, and it would be very difficult to deliver anything. I guess it also depends a bit on your choice of technology stack. So if you want to get into more details, then it might become a bit technical. I don't know which direction to take to better answer your question there.
So is there anything that you want to particularly speak on?
On the factory aspect, I don't think.
And we can go deep. If you want to go deeper technically, that's not a problem either. I'm sure people listening are going to say, yes, please.
Actually, it's kind of the same, but the other way around, right? Are there any like existing delivery patterns or approaches or tech stacks that you've encountered that actually inhibit some of this, like stuff that's maybe already entrenched? So like a really successful, high performing software engineering delivery organization starts to tackle ML. Are there any things that get in the way? Like, oh, actually, yeah, Scrum doesn't work in this case. That kind of, we need to rethink all this. This is kind of the same question, but the other way around, I think.
I see. Different aspects to that. Yeah, from the tech stack, really, I find that, yeah, there's an increasing number, and then I think we're getting into a slightly different topic that we wanted to discuss about today, but an increasing number of vendor solutions that try to tackle the end-to-end, all you need for ML. And as we really said earlier, we rarely see ML cases that contain only a model in production. That's only a small part of, usually a small part of your system. So those solutions can sometimes hinder the progress because maybe they don't interact or interoperate well with the other components of your system. So then you end up like plugging yourself like weird hacks to have your platform operating well with another custom algorithm that you need in your pipeline. So that's why I find it's very difficult to really count on a single one-size-fits-all solution ML platform for your enterprise and hope that it will suffice.
And along those lines, I mean, and I totally agree with you. The data's still, or the jury is still out, I should say, on if the all-in-one solutions are going to actually be useful and how useful they will be. But I'm wondering, when you're looking at that, like, and you're looking at different tools and bringing them into your data factory, how that looks too. Like, how do you measure if this is going to get me closer to that bottleneck that you were talking about? Like, how can you tell, and what are some metrics that you're looking at?
For me personally, I'm always a big fan of open source with an SDK that you can easily interact with. I tend to run away a bit from tools that try to make the problem too easy to solve for you, but which somehow your problem that you're working on is always just slightly different from the generic problem that they are attempting to solve. So that's one aspect of it.
So there's a few other things that you mentioned on here that I wanted to get into. And one of them, like, since we are talking about tools, you had spoken about different tools, and like once you get something into production, there's those day two operations. And you also mentioned an evaluation store that I think is, of course, in the community, everyone loves a store because everything is named a store these days. It's either got flow or store in the name. And you've covered like 90% of the MLOps tooling landscape. So, but for you, yeah, it was interesting that you wanted to bring up not only monitoring, but like what the concept of an evaluation store does. And maybe you can go into why that is interesting for you and what pains and problems you think that solves.
Yeah, so maybe you should consider renaming the YouTube playlist of coffee sessions into coffee session store. That could work well.
Or yeah, exactly. Just store flow store or store flows or something like that.
The flow store.
Yeah, that is. This is a total side note, but I thought it would be hilarious if like people interact with the community, and after X amount of interactions or emojis that they get on the Slack, then we give them a MLOps startup name as like an NFT, maybe just to make it really buzzy. So it's like your dedicated startup name is going to be Flow Store. And that's a bit of a side note, but yes, getting back to the original question, I'll let you answer it without interrupting with my wacky ideas.
All right, so maybe just taking a step back on how I got into talking about evaluation store. We ran a bit of a survey internally to go through all different models we had in the organization and to estimate the level of MLOps maturity per model. And so we tried to make it as much as possible purely yes or no questions, so we can compare across models. And yeah, those were questions about everything we could think of what would be an ideal MLOps architecture around those models. So it covered things like, do you know the exact Git hash of what is currently in production? Can you find exactly the code that was run, link it to the artifacts, those aspects, but also A/B testing, feature engineering, reusability, feature store, and we are getting into it to evaluation and monitoring. And I think, it turns out that among the two main observations we made there, I think the one was that we could improve on reusability of data pipelines and features. Another one was that we could also do better in terms of evaluation and monitoring. And it seemed to be seen as different solutions today, like what are your performances when you train, what's the performances on your test set, and then the monitoring and the performances in production. And with different tools, with different solutions, like you might just do a batch evaluation offline after your model training, and then you will have a different process that will gather the feedback and reevaluate your model performances in production. And it feels a bit weird to have similar operations like that are treated as separately in your system with separate solutions. It would make sense to have something more centralized. I'm not going to redo the talk, the initial talk on evaluation store, but I highly advise to watch it. I think I really like how evaluation is really integrated at all the steps of the idea of integrating evaluation at all the steps of your model lifecycle rather than having like custom separate solutions at different steps.
That really reminded me of, so we used to work for an Azure consultancy and we did a lot of work with the Dynamics product, which is like business applications. And we spoke to another partner who had done so many BI development, Power BI development things that if you had Finance Ops, it was called at the time, if you install that big bit of software in certain like market segments and verticals, they just had like, you spend this, you give us this much money, we press a few buttons and it automatically deploys all these reports, all these transformations, because actually, the customers always want kind of the same things. The accountants always want to see this split things, that split. And that is like the dream state you kind of want to get to with this stuff, right? Isn't it? Where you're cookie cuttering that kind of pattern and adjusting it around the edges. So I've seen that succeed. That's a really cool approach. One thing I wanted to ask then off the back of that was, and kind of related to the assessment stuff you've done, which you might want to talk about a bit as well. But what's the like biggest gap out there then? What's the kind of, if you had all the investment and all the right skills, you'd go and do it? Or what's the big, the one tool you wish existed that's maybe not there just yet that would bridge that gap?
Yeah, I would be excited to see what solutions will exist in the near future for evaluation, and just like really an API you call at many different steps of your model lifecycle to have a consistent way of evaluating and monitoring your model. On a different note, something that I found is also overlooked a bit in the data science team is ability for web and front-end development. It's sometimes it can be very easy to roll out a quick and ugly dashboard, but it can really create a lot of value and bring a lot of attention to your model if you can spend a bit more time and effort on making something nicer and more useful and tailored for your particular use case. But I always found it very difficult to find someone with the time and the skills to build nice visualization or dashboards or interactive UIs for your product.
Yeah, and I think that's got to be, in my mind, I completely agree with you, but that's got to be because of just the number of tools out there that get taught. And I think, like, in the education for people coming into the industry, some people get taught Plotly, some people get taught Tableau, some people get taught Power BI, Grafana. Like, you pick 10 data scientists and ask them to do your dashboard, and you'll get 11 different tools used for the same task. I think it's actually a real shame, and it is a hindrance to people's development and the kind of the progression of that part of the art, right? Because we can't seem to pick a framework and all stick to it.
It's so funny you say that because I have seen some people come through and they've talked to me about, like, the last mile, as they call it, the last mile of the machine learning projects. And it's that very thing right there. And I'm like, wait a minute, hasn't this been solved with other tools? And so it's funny that you say that there's more tools than we know what to do with. And so we have various different ways of doing it. And then you end up with it's like very muddied waters.
Yeah, I think by mentioning web developers or front-end developers, I just brought one more tool into the mix, which might not be exactly a solution here. It's also due to time and priorities. I think the value is underestimated, and so it's not necessarily put as a high priority. You always have something to debug or a new feature to add or a new version of your model to roll out before you really invest the time on that last mile.
So before we finish up, I definitely wanted to get into that survey and the MLOps assessment that you put out for the community. And maybe you can give us a bit of background on it and then go into what you found.
Yeah, so we had many different models implemented by different teams within the organization, and we were trying to identify what would be the products as a central team, what would be the products that we could build internally to help those teams. What are the common pain points, or alternatively also finding what are the problems that were solved by certain team and which might need to be rolled out to other teams. So we try to create a wish list a list of bullet points of yes or no questions to estimate your level of MLOps maturity. I think it reminded me a bit of one of the talks that you had in the community on engineering best practices.
From Alex.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what we built. So that's what a good opportunity to leverage the knowledge of the community there. So I shared it on a Google document at the time, and it was a few community members kindly helped and added their feedback to it. So that was very cool to get some help there. Since then, I think we have added a few questions. I think model interpretability has been added. I could update it soon to make sure that if someone goes to check it out after the call, that they have an up-to-date version. And yeah, the main pain points were really about reusability. So I think that's something we touched a bit upon when we talked about centralized versus decentralized. You have decentralized teams building their products, but then they often would rebuild the same features or the same data transformations. And so you're not in a position where you can pick a data transformation or a feature from a different team and reuse it immediately in your model and see if it improves anything. So that kind of more centralized feature store or library of data transformations that can be used by different teams. That's possible solution that can be brought for based on the survey. And the other one was really about monitoring. Fast monitoring alerts. Is the monitoring triggering a retrain of the model? How fast can you also investigate and understand what is going wrong with your model if you have an alert popping up? Those were I think the major the points of improvement that were identified consistently across multiple products.
And so were they given to so who owns that development then? Are they given to an internal product owner? Does that become like an internal product that you work on, and what teams, or is it like a collaborative thing internally where you're all contributing to it? How does that actually happen? Like if I'm in a company now, we identify those issues. How do we do what kind of path would you recommend we take to do that same stuff?
There are different approaches you could take there, and it might depend on organization. In our case, we have a central team, so that central team can at least build the initial version of it, but the intention is that it becomes a community maintained and community developed product. That if a user wants an extra feature that you can implement it yourself and do a pull request, and it becomes like an inner source kind of reusable library throughout the organization. So that's one way to approach it, but it depends a bit on how much resources and capability and capacity you have between the central team, if you have any, and those different product teams. At the other end of the spectrum, you just have the different teams, different product teams that build their own tool for themselves and just publish it for their colleagues.
Luckily for us, I just got my buzzword bingo card filled out. Adam, Datamesh, huge. I also want to explore more on that. The community that they have going is, like you said, it's very zeitgeist. They have a lot of momentum, and it's interesting to think of how it works with data scientists and machine learning, and especially who has implemented it really well when it comes to machine learning, or can it be implemented really well with machine learning? I'm exploring it. I've actually interviewed a few people that are doing Datamesh, actually for and against Datamesh. And it's for a podcast that we're hoping to produce in the next year. And it's going to be more like narrative style podcast. But there's a lot of stuff, that still is very up in the air. And when I spoke with one guy who had implemented it at his company, one thing that he said is it was like a spectrum. It wasn't like, oh, you have to do this, this, and this, and these are the steps that you have to follow. It was like, I take this idea and I implement it on the spectrum. It wasn't binary by any means. So hopefully I can get that out to you, Adam, because I know you'll be interested to see it. But I wanted to ask you, John, on this. Don't tell me now. I forgot it because I was messing around with the buzzword bingo. No, what were we talking about before this in the data mesh? And what were we talking about before the data mesh that I can't remember now?
The assessment on the community, that's something the last thing I talked about.
And then my question was about who owns it, the product.
And who owns that? And nope. It'll come back to me if it's super important, but
too much eggnog.
Yeah, too much eggnog in this sweater. Oh man, I was focusing too much on my bingo. But yeah, so I guess there is, it's on the tip of my tongue. I don't know if you've got one, Adam, that you could fill it with while I come up with the question again, because this is going to frustrate me. I was super excited to ask it.
It's quite fun to just watch you suffer. Actually.
This is very kind of you. So, I
was talking a bit about spectrum between centralized or decentralized teams and sharing libraries and tools. I don't know if that rings any bell.
Yeah, that does help, but it still is just like right here and I can't access it.
But I think that's a really difficult point for a lot of teams as well, right? Is that balance between pure autonomy in each team, let the team do what they want and use what they like, and kind of economies of scale of actually, if we all use this technology, we're all going to get more expertise in it. We can start getting specialists and things. Do you find, is there any sort of tips on balance there, John, on how to find that, or have you any experience in that regard?
I don't really have best practices there. I think it's a balancing act that a lot of companies are experiencing. I would just throw a bit of opinion in there, and I think it's important to always make sure that the teams can still experiment. Just because, great ideas might flourish there, and then you share with the rest of the team. So that, for sure, as long as you give enough autonomy to the teams to experiment with new tools and new solutions, that's something I would consider important.
Well, I don't think, sadly, this question is going to come back to me. And we're hitting time. I want to say thank you so much, John. This has been awesome, man. I appreciate you coming on here. Also, Adam, thank you for taking the time, co-hosting with me. And if anyone else wants to look at what you were talking about, John, with the survey that you put out, we're going to leave a link to that in the description. It's super cool to see that people from the MLOps community are working on it. They're helping you. And I know that by the time we hang up this call, I'm going to remember exactly what I wanted to ask you. And
did you
then
say
I'll put it in Slack.
Including Crousse at the end or something like that?
Yeah, I'm going to do an intro right now for you at the end.
Okay.
And then I'll ask the question as one to the community, maybe. So, yeah, man, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. And if anyone wants to stay in touch with you, how can they reach out?
On the community on Slack, I think that I check it often enough.
Awesome. Sweet. Well, this has been a bit of a debacle on my part, but this has been awesome. I really appreciate all of you tuning in, listening. If you are still listening, one thing that really helps us is a like and a subscribe and a comment and all of that. And I've got a little munchkin that is trying to jump in here. So we'll leave it at that. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot for having me.